At first glance, theirs looked like a Hollywood love story that was destined to last forever. A young, ambitious actress on the brink of stardom and a rising film producer known for his drive, his confidence, and his uncanny ability to turn scripts into silver screen moments. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Meghan Markle and Trevor Engelson were, to everyone watching, the perfect couple. Two worlds that seemed aligned in charm, purpose, and ambition. But behind that polished curtain of red carpet smiles and Instagram-ready moments, something else was unfolding. Something darker, colder, and more orchestrated than anyone could have imagined. Trevor was only in his early 30s when he met Meghan, a woman who, at that time, was still years away from global fame. She was trying to break through in Hollywood, bouncing between casting calls and small-time television roles, determined to become something more than just another pretty face in Los Angeles. To Trevor, she wasn't yet the woman who would someday sit beside British royalty. She was simply Meghan, a hard-working, intelligent woman who seemed to appreciate his dedication to the craft and his belief in building things from the ground up. He admired that about her, at least in the beginning. But as Trevor now admits, everything about that relationship, from the way she smiled when the cameras flashed, to the carefully chosen words she used in public, to the way she cried during private arguments, felt like a performance. Everything was scripted, he reportedly said in private conversations that have since surfaced. Even her emotions. Those words hang heavy because they pierce through the illusion that so many had about Meghan Markle before the world even knew her as a duchess. To understand how that illusion began, you have to go back to the start. Before the royal headlines, before the global controversies, before the world fell under the spell of a perfectly crafted narrative. You have to go back to the days when Meghan was still building her brand and Trevor Engelson was the man standing quietly beside her, funding, supporting, and believing in that brand, only to discover too late that he was part of the script and not the partner he thought he was. The story begins like many others in Hollywood, with ambition, love, and the seductive promise of fame. Trevor was a producer in his prime, known for his sharp instincts and relentless work ethic. He wasn't one of those men who sought the spotlight. He operated behind the camera, creating the kind of stories that others would live out on screen. Meghan, on the other hand, was drawn to the light. She had charm, wit, and an undeniable presence, qualities that could disarm anyone who met her. When the two met, the chemistry was instant, and their friends described their early days as electric. But even then, according to people who knew them closely, Meghan had a certain focus that went beyond affection. She studied people, their influence, their reactions, their connections. Trevor says that when he looks back now, he can see the patterns clearly, the way she seemed to measure every encounter, every emotional exchange, like she was collecting material for a role. At the time, though, he mistook it for curiosity. She was attentive, flattering, deeply present when she wanted to be. She made him feel like the center of her world, and for a man whose life revolved around storytelling, it felt like he had finally found someone who understood the rhythm of his world. But the first cracks began to appear when Meghan's career started to accelerate. The early struggles gave way to new opportunities, and her small television roles started to turn into recurring appearances. She became more image-conscious, more strategic. Friends noticed that she began to distance herself from the old crowd, the ones who didn't fit the aesthetic she was cultivating. Trevor, with his straightforward demeanor and long working hours, suddenly found himself living with someone who had begun to treat life like a production set. He recalls moments where he felt like an extra in his own marriage. The dinners that were once spontaneous became rehearsed. The smiles seemed more deliberate. Even arguments, Trevor said, began to feel pre-written, as if Meghan was delivering lines she had practiced. She'd pause mid-argument, he once told a friend, like she was checking her delivery. These aren't the words of a bitter man. They're the reflections of someone who has spent years analyzing what went wrong. Trevor isn't the kind to dramatize for attention. He avoided interviews for years, keeping his dignity while Meghan's name became a global brand. But now, at 48, he says the time for silence has ended. Because what happened in that marriage, he believes, explains everything that came afterward: the royal rebellion, the media wars, and the stories of emotional manipulation that have followed her across continents. It wasn't about one argument or one betrayal. It was about the realization that his marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a performance, one with a script, an audience, and an exit plan. Trevor describes the chilling moment he understood this truth. It was after yet another long week apart, Meghan in Toronto filming Suits, Trevor juggling his film projects in Los Angeles. They had planned a quiet reunion weekend, but when he arrived, she treated him like a guest in her life, not a partner returning home. Her tone was polite, detached, rehearsed. The intimacy they once shared had been replaced with something transactional. "I felt like I was being managed," Trevor confessed. "Like every move I made was part of a scene she was directing." That moment, he says, was the turning point. He began to see how Meghan operated, how every public smile masked private calculation, how every emotional gesture seemed designed for effect. The Meghan he loved was gone, replaced by a persona that never slipped, not even in the quiet moments. The marriage deteriorated quickly after that. By the time she had cemented her role in Suits and was being recognized on red carpets, the emotional gap between them had turned into a chasm. Trevor tried to reach her. Dinners, trips, gifts, long conversations that often ended in circles. But each time he thought they were reconnecting, she would pull back with a line that sounded almost rehearsed. "You just don't understand the pressure I'm under." He wanted to understand. He wanted to be supportive. But what he didn't realize then, and what he finally admits now, is that he wasn't part of her real world anymore, because that world no longer existed. Everything had become an image, a projection, a controlled narrative that had no room for authenticity. "I stopped recognizing her," he said, "and I think she stopped recognizing herself too." Those who knew Trevor say the divorce shattered him, not just because he lost a wife, but because he lost faith in what was real. For years, he questioned whether he had imagined the entire relationship, whether the woman who laughed with him, who shared dreams with him, who whispered promises late at night, had ever existed beyond the performance. It's a haunting thought, to realize that the love you built your life around might have been someone's rehearsal for a bigger stage. When Meghan sent back her wedding rings by courier, without a personal note, Trevor said it was the final confirmation of everything he had suspected. There was no confrontation, no emotional closure, just a silent, efficient ending. Like the final act of a play, the curtain dropped, and the audience, the public, never saw the mess backstage. And that's the part Trevor says people never understood. They saw the glamorous divorce headlines, the rise of Meghan Markle the celebrity, and later Meghan the Duchess. They didn't see the man who was left behind trying to separate memory from illusion. For nearly a decade, Trevor kept that pain private. He built a new life, remarried, started over. But in recent interviews and conversations, fragments of that old story have resurfaced. And this time, Trevor hasn't denied them. When asked directly whether Meghan's emotions were genuine during their marriage, he paused, took a deep breath, and said something that caught everyone off guard. "I think she believed they were, in the moment, but they were always part of a bigger performance." That statement, simple as it sounds, changes everything. It reframes not just his relationship with Meghan, but her entire public image. If Trevor's account is true, it suggests that what the world saw, from her marriage to him, to her rise in Hollywood, to her eventual royal life, may have all followed a similar script, carefully written, meticulously acted, and powerfully delivered. But Trevor doesn't speak with bitterness. He speaks with the calm of someone who has finally accepted that the past cannot be rewritten. "You can't stay angry forever," he said. "At some point, you realize that some people don't fall in love with you. They fall in love with the story they can create through you." That's what makes his confession so striking. It's not just about Meghan Markle or a failed marriage. It's about authenticity in an age where image rules everything. It's about the danger of living a life where performance becomes reality, where you can no longer tell where the role ends and the real person begins. As Trevor tells it now, their marriage wasn't a tragedy. It was a warning about what happens when ambition overshadows emotion, when storytelling replaces sincerity, and when a relationship becomes another production, with one person always acting and the other always watching. That is the foundation of this investigation. In the chapters that follow, we'll uncover how Trevor's quiet observations match patterns that others have since noticed. The same behaviors that would later surface in Meghan's royal years. From emotional manipulation to strategic image building, the blueprint was there all along. But before we move forward, one thing remains clear. Trevor Engelson didn't just lose a wife. He lost the illusion of authenticity. And when he finally decided to speak, his words weren't aimed at revenge. They were an attempt to reclaim reality, to separate the woman he once loved from the character she became. This is the story of how love turned into a script, how a producer fell for a performance, and how, years later, the truth has begun to rewrite everything we thought we knew about Meghan Markle. The story of Trevor Engelson and Meghan Markle's Hollywood beginning is one of those tales that seem to start with all the right ingredients. Timing, chemistry, ambition, and opportunity. In those early years, there was no royal palace, no international media frenzy, no carefully crafted statements. There was just a young actress chasing her dreams and a Hollywood producer who believed he had finally found someone who understood his world. What Trevor didn't realize then was that he wasn't just meeting a partner. He was stepping into the first act of a story that would one day consume headlines across the globe. They met in Los Angeles in the mid-2000s, at a time when both were trying to carve out a place for themselves in a city that rewarded confidence and punished vulnerability. Trevor was already working behind the scenes, developing film projects and networking with industry insiders. He was respected, even if not yet famous, and people around him knew he had a sharp instinct for storytelling. Meghan, on the other hand, was still on the outside of Hollywood's bright circle, moving from one small television gig to another. She was determined, endlessly social, and always curious. Friends who knew them then described their connection as magnetic. Trevor liked her warmth, her energy, and her focus. Meghan liked his drive, his status, and his ability to open doors. From the start, their relationship moved fast. Trevor had dated actresses before, but Meghan seemed different. She had a way of making him feel like every conversation mattered, every idea he shared was brilliant. He once told a colleague that she had the rare ability to make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. But even in those early days, there were subtle signs of calculation beneath the charm. Meghan was known to study people, to observe what worked, what didn't, how certain smiles or tones could shift a dynamic. One of her college acquaintances once described her as a quick learner of human behavior, someone who could mirror the energy of whoever she was with until she got what she wanted. For Trevor, these traits seemed fascinating, not alarming. He was used to the performative nature of Hollywood, where everyone was pitching a version of themselves. Meghan's ambition felt familiar. She wasn't just another struggling actress waiting for luck to strike. She was a strategist. She talked about brand building long before the concept became fashionable. She wrote handwritten thank you notes to casting directors, kept track of connections, and presented herself as polished and articulate at every event. She knew how to make people remember her. Trevor admired her work ethic. In those early months, he thought he had found someone who shared his hunger for success and the discipline to achieve it. Their romance unfolded like a montage out of a romantic drama. Dinners at quiet restaurants in West Hollywood, weekends in Malibu, long nights spent talking about scripts, projects, and dreams. Meghan often talked about wanting to use her platform for something greater, even before she had one. She told Trevor she believed she was meant for something bigger, though she didn't yet know what. He found that confidence refreshing. He was drawn to her optimism and her certainty that her life was going somewhere important. But there were also small moments that hinted at how she viewed relationships. She liked control over details, over appearances, over perception. If Trevor was late for dinner, she would joke about how it looked bad, rather than how it made her feel. When they attended parties, she often seemed to be performing a version of herself, adjusting her tone to match the energy of the crowd, shifting her expressions depending on who was watching. It wasn't that she was insincere. It was that she treated every social encounter like a stage. For Trevor, that was part of her charm. He saw it as confidence, not choreography. By the time Trevor proposed, Meghan's career was finally beginning to gain momentum. She had landed minor roles on television shows and was slowly becoming a familiar face. They married in 2011 at a beachside ceremony in Jamaica, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and family. It was a lively celebration, carefree, sun-soaked, filled with laughter and music. But looking back now, Trevor says that even during those wedding days he sensed a shift. Meghan seemed more focused on how things appeared than how they felt. Every detail was curated. She gave direction to the photographer, corrected the angle of her bouquet, adjusted her posture before each picture. Trevor brushed it off as typical bridal perfectionism. But in hindsight, he wonders if that day was less about marriage and more about crafting the first image of her next chapter. In the early months of their marriage, the dynamic between them began to change subtly. Meghan's career continued to rise, and she started traveling frequently for auditions and appearances. She spent long periods away filming suits in Toronto, while Trevor managed projects in Los Angeles. They became, in many ways, a long-distance couple. At first, they handled it with optimism. They sent each other gifts, exchanged long emails, and scheduled calls between shoots. But over time, those gestures became routine, something to check off, not something to feel. Trevor would later say that this was when he began to realize that Meghan's affection was often performative. When they were together in public, she was affectionate, attentive, smiling. When they were alone, the warmth seemed to fade. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt transactional. It was like she was managing an image, Trevor told a close associate. Even with me. He began to feel like an observer in his own relationship, watching someone play the part of the perfect partner without truly inhabiting it. Friends noticed the distance too. Meghan's social media was filled with positive affirmations, quotes about strength and independence, perfectly filtered snapshots of her lifestyle. Trevor rarely appeared in them. When asked, she would say she preferred to keep some things private. But those around her felt that privacy was less about protection and more about control. She was already curating a narrative, one in which she was the independent, rising star. Trevor, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly uneasy. He had built his career on understanding stories, on recognizing structure, motive, and climax. And in his own life, he started to see those same elements unfolding around him. He began to feel like their relationship had a beginning, middle, and an inevitable end, and that Meghan was already preparing for the next act. There were moments, he recalled, when she looked at me and I felt like she wasn't really seeing me. She was seeing the version of herself that she wanted to be next. One of the clearest signs came during a visit to Toronto while Meghan was filming. Trevor flew out to surprise her, expecting the kind of reunion they used to have. Instead, she seemed distracted, focused on her schedule and her public image. When they went out to dinner, she spent more time on her phone than talking to him. When he mentioned it, she brushed him off with a polished line about managing opportunities. He later said that conversation felt like talking to a spokesperson rather than a wife. The more Meghan's career grew, the more she detached emotionally. It wasn't the fame itself that created the divide, it was her relationship with it. She thrived on attention, validation, and admiration, while Trevor valued authenticity, quietness, and loyalty. Their values were starting to clash. When he tried to talk about it, she would deflect or rationalize her behavior. She had a way of turning everything into a narrative, he said. Even our fights had structure, a setup, tension, resolution. It was never spontaneous. As her professional identity solidified, so did her public persona. Meghan became more conscious of the people around her and began distancing herself from anyone who didn't fit the image she wanted to project. Trevor's friends, who had once been welcomed, were now seen as irrelevant. Meghan preferred the company of publicists, stylists, and people who could help her brand evolve. It was clear she was no longer just chasing roles. She was building an empire, one image at a time. And Trevor, in his own way, was being written out of the story. Their marriage, which had once been a partnership of equals, began to feel like a supporting role he was no longer meant to play. When Meghan talked about the future, her words were filled with ambition. Global recognition, influence, impact. But Trevor noticed that her vision rarely included him. He had become a backdrop, a footnote in her journey to something bigger. The love that had once felt real now felt like a marketing campaign that had reached its expiration date. What makes this period so haunting in retrospect is how subtle the transformation was. Meghan didn't suddenly become someone else. She evolved into a version of herself that fit her aspirations. The problem, Trevor says, was that this version had no room for genuine connection. Every decision was filtered through the lens of perception, how things looked, how they would be received, how they could be used. And by the time he realized it, the woman he had fallen in love with no longer existed. She had become the role she had always wanted to play. When Trevor speaks about those years now, he does so with a mix of sadness and clarity. He doesn't describe betrayal in the traditional sense. He describes erasure, the gradual disappearance of something real, replaced by something rehearsed. He remembers moments of laughter that felt rehearsed, apologies that sounded memorized, and love that seemed conditional on how it served her image. He says the hardest part wasn't losing Meghan. It was realizing she had been leaving long before the end. In those early Hollywood days, before anyone knew the name Meghan Markle outside a few television circles, Trevor thought he was helping his wife build a dream. What he didn't see was that he was helping her construct a brand. Every red carpet moment, every social interaction, every calculated smile was another brick in the wall between who she was and who she wanted the world to see. And when that wall was finished, there was no space left for him inside. That was the Hollywood beginning, bright, promising, and perfectly staged. It was the first act in a larger story that would one day repeat itself on a royal stage, in front of millions of spectators. But back then, Trevor was just a man in love, unaware that the script had already been written, and that he would soon find himself playing a role he never auditioned for. The man left behind in someone else's story. From the outside, Meghan and Trevor's marriage looked like a Hollywood success story in motion, the kind of relationship that seemed untouched by the chaos of the entertainment industry. A rising actress and an ambitious producer, living between red carpets and production sets, sharing their lives under the glow of a dream city. But Trevor Engelson would later admit that what seemed perfect was, in truth, disturbingly artificial. Behind the laughter, behind the flashbulbs, behind the curated smiles, he realized that their marriage was less about love and more about presentation. He called it a movie without emotion, a production where the director and lead actor were the same person, Meghan. He had noticed it early on, but back then it felt harmless. Meghan always had a certain control over how she presented herself. She cared about posture, lighting, tone. She wanted moments to look right, not just feel right. If they were at a dinner with friends, she'd angle her seat toward the better lighting, or subtly adjust her expression depending on who was looking. Trevor would laugh it off. It was just part of her actress training, he thought, an instinct that came naturally to her. But soon, he realized those instincts never turned off. They weren't limited to sets or auditions. They were everywhere, woven into every exchange, every decision, every show of affection. Their marriage became a stage where everything was scripted, and Trevor, unknowingly, was playing along. When Meghan landed her big break on Suits, their lives changed overnight. She was suddenly recognized, praised, and sought after. Her social circle shifted. Her tone when she spoke changed too, refined, careful, polished. Trevor noticed that even in private moments, she began to choose her words like someone preparing for an audience. She rehearsed emotional conversations, controlled the atmosphere, and seemed to perform even in silence. It wasn't an immediate transformation. It was gradual, invisible to anyone not paying attention. But Trevor paid attention, and slowly it began to drain him. He once described coming home to her as walking into a set where the cameras were always rolling. If he came home exhausted from a shoot, she'd greet him with a perfect smile and soft tone. But there was no warmth behind it. She'd say all the right words, he told a confidant. But it felt like she was reading from a script she wrote in her head. And if something unexpected happened, A disagreement, a moment of frustration. She would shift instantly, regaining composure, adjusting her voice, her face, as though she was aware that any emotional crack could ruin the performance. It was like she was acting the role of a wife, Trevor said, not being one. The people who saw them together often commented on how composed Meghan was. She never lost her cool, never let anger spill over in public, never said anything impulsive. It was impressive, almost enviable, but to Trevor it became unsettling. It's not that she didn't have emotions, he explained later. It's that she managed them like a director managing a scene. You could see her decide what to feel. That realization hit him hardest when he realized how rare genuine moments between them had become. Spontaneous laughter was replaced by timed responses. Affection became symbolic, not emotional. A quick kiss before cameras. An arm looped through his during events, perfectly placed and perfectly detached. Their home became an extension of her performance. Meghan would insist that everything be tidy, presentable, aesthetic. Even small domestic moments, cooking together, lounging after work, seemed orchestrated. She was hyper-aware of how their lives would look to others. If Trevor left his script pages on the table, she'd move them aside before guests arrived. If friends came over, she'd guide the conversation, subtly steering it toward topics that showcased her intelligence or worldliness. She was, Trevor later admitted, a master at controlling perception. And for a while he admired that. But admiration turned to confusion when he realized he didn't know where the performance ended. There was one evening he never forgot, a dinner party at their Los Angeles home. Meghan had invited a mix of industry contacts and friends. Everything was planned down to the detail, the lighting, the menu, the playlist. She wanted to impress. The night went smoothly. Guests laughed, conversations flowed. Meghan was radiant, telling stories, charming everyone, exuding warmth. Trevor watched her with quiet admiration until he noticed something unsettling. The moment the last guest left and the door closed, her face dropped. The smile disappeared, her shoulders straightened, her tone changed. "That's done," she said, walking away. Not a word about the night, not a glance at him. Just that flat sentence delivered like a closing line. Trevor said that was the moment he realized their marriage existed in two realities. One for the world, and one for them, and the second one was empty. Her obsession with control grew as her public profile expanded. She started managing every part of their shared life as though it was part of a media strategy. If Trevor made a casual remark that she didn't like, she'd gently correct it, not out of irritation, but because she believed it didn't align with the image. Friends who visited them said she carried herself with the kind of composure usually reserved for press junkets. She smiled, listened attentively, gave thoughtful answers. And yet, when the moment passed, she'd drift into silence, her focus somewhere else. Trevor called it the switch. 1 second warm and charming, the next cold and distant, as though she had walked off stage. He began to feel like a stranger living with an actress who was never out of costume. He tried to bring it up once, asking her if she ever felt exhausted from maintaining the act. Meghan laughed it off, telling him she wasn't acting. She was just being the best version of herself. That phrase stuck with him. The best version. He realized then that the woman he loved had replaced authenticity with optimization. Every interaction, every gesture was part of a calculated version of herself, sculpted to perfection, untouchable, and unreal. The deeper Trevor looked, the more he noticed. When they went out, she would subtly adjust her emotions based on who they were with. Around producers, she was confident and articulate. Around philanthropists, humble and intellectual. Around close friends, relaxed but never unguarded. It was as if she had a personality template for every environment. Trevor couldn't pinpoint when it began to feel wrong, but he knew when it began to hurt, when he realized her affection was no longer spontaneous. It arrived when expected, disappeared when inconvenient, and reappeared when it benefited her. She knew how to love like a professional, he said. Just enough to keep you close, not enough to let you in. Their marriage became a press kit of emotions. Prepackaged, perfectly presented, and entirely hollow. Trevor started retreating into his work. The energy he once poured into their relationship went into his projects. But the more he distanced himself, the more Meghan seemed unfazed. If anything, she appeared relieved. She filled her time with networking, charity events, self-development workshops. She often spoke about alignment, about becoming the person she was meant to be. To Trevor, it sounded like she was rehearsing for a new role, one where he didn't belong. One day, while reviewing footage for a film, Trevor had a strange realization. Watching a scene in which an actress pretended to break down in tears, he felt a jolt of familiarity. The controlled breathing, the trembling voice, the subtle pause before the tear. It reminded him of Meghan. Not because she acted in that film, but because he had seen those exact gestures at home during their fights. That was when it hit him. Her emotional reactions had patterns. Anger, sadness, apology. Each followed a rhythm. Even her expressions of regret came with perfect timing. Once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Their final year together felt like a rehearsed drama on loop. Meghan's fame grew, her priorities shifted, and Trevor became a background character in her new script. When she was offered interviews or appearances, she always went alone. When Trevor asked why, she'd say it was better for her brand. When he suggested they take a trip to reconnect, she declined, citing career focus. She had replaced partnership with strategy. By the time they separated, there was no confrontation, no emotional explosion, just a clean, efficient exit, as though she had planned it for months. After the divorce, Trevor reflected on what had really happened. It wasn't that Meghan had stopped loving him. It was that she had outgrown the role he played in her story. Their marriage had served its purpose. A chapter in her ascent, a symbol of stability before global fame. Once the narrative evolved, there was no reason for him to remain in the cast. It was never chaos, he said. It was choreography. That phrase, choreography, captures what defined their years together. Every smile, every word, every embrace was part of a routine polished to perfection. Their love wasn't destroyed by conflict or betrayal, but by performance. And Trevor, a producer who built his career on recognizing scripts, had lived inside one without realizing it. He now says that those years taught him the difference between authenticity and performance, between love and the illusion of it. Meghan didn't love in the way most people do, freely, messily, vulnerably. She loved with intention, with control, with precision. And for a while it worked, until it didn't, until the man watching the performance finally realized that the spotlight was never meant to shine on him. By the time their marriage ended, the cameras had already moved on. Meghan's career was blooming, her public image transforming. Trevor faded quietly into the background, nursing the realization that what he thought was a love story had been a production from start to finish. When he finally spoke years later, his words carried no bitterness, only truth. Everything was scripted, even her emotions. It was sometime between the long filming nights and the missed phone calls that Trevor Engelson realized something had changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like the slow dimming of a light you don't notice until the room has gone dark. Meghan Markle, the woman he had once known as spontaneous, warm, and endlessly curious, had become distant in ways he couldn't fully explain. She was still polite, still smiling, still performing affection. But the depth was gone. What he didn't know at the time was that he was beginning to see what he would later call the cracks in the performance. This was when the mask slipped, and for the first time, Trevor began to see the real woman behind the role. In public, Meghan had never looked better. Her success on Suits had solidified her as a recognizable face in the entertainment industry. She had access to events, media coverage, and a growing fan base. But in private, Trevor found her harder to reach than ever. Phone calls became short and functional. Text messages that once carried affection turned into reminders and scheduling notes. He told a friend it was like being married to an assistant who managed him rather than loved him. "I was there," he said, "but I wasn't part of her world anymore. I was part of her storyline." The first real confrontation between them didn't come from anger, but from confusion. Trevor had flown to Toronto to surprise Meghan, hoping to reconnect. He brought gifts, planned a quiet evening, and wanted to escape the noise of Hollywood. But when he arrived, Meghan's reaction wasn't excitement. It was irritation. She greeted him with a half-smile and the kind of polite warmth you give to a distant acquaintance. "You should have called first," she said, barely making eye contact. That sentence haunted him for months. He had expected joy. Instead, he felt like an inconvenience. Later that evening, he tried to talk to her about how distant they had become. Meghan listened, nodded occasionally, and said she understood. But her tone was flat, her eyes distracted. When Trevor grew emotional, she remained calm, almost detached. "You're overthinking this," she told him softly. "You're being dramatic." To most, those words might sound like mild reassurance. But to Trevor, they felt surgical, emotionless, precise, designed to end the conversation without engaging in it. It was the first time he realized that her calm wasn't peace. It was control. Friends who saw Trevor around that time said he looked defeated. He was a man who made a career out of reading scripts, studying emotion, and understanding motivation. Yet in his own marriage, he couldn't find a way to connect to the truth. Meghan's emotional responses were too perfect, too rehearsed. If she cried, it felt cinematic, timed, composed, symmetrical. If she apologized, her words sounded like lines rehearsed in advance. And when she smiled, it rarely reached her eyes. "It's like she was trying to feel," Trevor said, "but didn't know how without direction." The people closest to Meghan noticed it too, though few dared to mention it. They would describe her as kind, but calculated. She could turn charm on and off like a light switch. She knew how to make people adore her, but she struggled to maintain genuine closeness. When Trevor confided in one of Meghan's colleagues on set, the response was telling. "She's great at playing emotions. It's what she does best." At the time, Trevor didn't want to believe that observation applied to his marriage. But deep down, he knew it did. There were moments that made the realization impossible to ignore. One night, Trevor returned to Los Angeles early from a shoot, hoping to surprise her. He found Meghan at their home, sitting on the couch, reading through scripts. When she saw him, she didn't jump up in surprise or hug him. She simply looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "Oh, you're back." That was it. No warmth, no spark, no welcome. Trevor said he stood there for a full minute, waiting for the moment to shift into something real. It never did. Instead, she went back to reading, leaving him standing there in silence. Another memory haunted him even more. A party they attended in Los Angeles. Meghan had been the star of the evening, dazzling everyone with her wit and poise. People surrounded her, complimenting her, asking about her show. Trevor watched from the sidelines, proud but uneasy. After the event, as they walked to the car, he mentioned how incredible she'd been. Meghan smiled and said, "I know. I rehearsed that story all day." Trevor laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But when he looked at her face, he saw she meant it. Every word, every gesture, every laugh she'd shared with those guests had been prepared. Not spontaneous, not sincere, just practiced. That was the moment Trevor began to feel he was living with someone who no longer knew the difference between acting and reality. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was part of her coping mechanism, the way she managed stress in a competitive industry. Maybe she had become so good at her job that it spilled into her personal life. But the more he justified it, the more it ate at him. "You can't build a marriage on performance," he said years later. "Eventually, the real person has to show up," and she never did. As their distance grew, Trevor began to test her reactions in small ways. He would say something emotional or unexpected, just to see if she would respond instinctively. Most of the time, she didn't. Instead, she paused, always paused, before reacting. It was as if she was choosing which version of herself to present. When he confronted her about it, Meghan denied it completely. "That's just how I think," she said. "I like to respond thoughtfully." But Trevor could tell the difference between thoughtfulness and performance. He had worked with enough actors to recognize the subtle delay of someone stepping into character. The deeper they fell apart, the more Trevor noticed patterns in her behavior. Whenever he expressed hurt or frustration, she deflected with calm logic. If he became emotional, she accused him of being unprofessional, an odd word to use in a marriage. She would often remind him of how lucky they were, how perfect their life looked. Those words stung. They weren't about feelings, they were about optics. Meghan was more concerned with how their relationship appeared than how it truly was. It wasn't about happiness, Trevor said. It was about presentation. By this point, their private life had become mechanical. Conversations revolved around schedules, public appearances, and social engagements. Intimacy had become rare. When Trevor tried to reignite their closeness, Meghan often brushed it off with excuses about work or exhaustion. But he noticed something deeper, a disinterest that went beyond fatigue. She didn't want connection. She wanted control. Every time he tried to express something genuine, she redirected the topic, as though vulnerability made her uncomfortable. It was as if she had built emotional walls so high that even she couldn't see over them anymore. Their marriage finally hit the breaking point during what should have been a quiet weekend together in Los Angeles. Trevor had taken time off work, planning a surprise dinner and movie night at home. He cooked, set up candles, tried to create the warmth they'd lost. Meghan arrived late, took one look at the setup and sighed. "This is sweet," she said softly, "but I have lines to run." Trevor said he felt something inside him collapse at that moment. "It was like realizing the person you love has already left," he said. "You're just waiting for the credits to roll." After that, things between them grew cold. Meghan stopped pretending to be emotionally invested. She became polite, efficient, professional. She handled the logistics of ending their relationship with the same composure she handled everything else. Neatly, cleanly, without sentiment. When she mailed back her wedding ring, there was no letter, no note, no goodbye. Just the symbol of a marriage returned like a prop no longer needed. Looking back, Trevor says that the scariest part wasn't the end itself. It was realizing how long the end had been playing out unnoticed. "The performance had started long before I saw it," he admitted. "I was in the audience the whole time." For years, he tried to understand how someone could fake so much for so long. But now he sees it differently. Meghan wasn't pretending for him. She was surviving through performance. It was how she navigated the world. It wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. That understanding didn't make the pain easier, but it made it clearer. Trevor finally saw that the mask had never slipped for Meghan because it wasn't a mask at all. It was who she had become. A woman who lived entirely through the roles she played, one after another, each more convincing than the last. And by the time he realized it, the woman he fell in love with had long disappeared into the character she created. When Meghan Markle landed her breakout role on the television drama Suits, it wasn't just a turning point in her career. It was the silent unraveling of her marriage to Trevor Engelson. What had once been a Hollywood love story grounded in shared ambition and laughter began to shift into something colder, more distant, and profoundly unfamiliar. As her star rose, their bond fractured under the weight of distance, fame, and something deeper. The emergence of an entirely new version of Meghan, one that Trevor no longer recognized. The decision to film Suits in Toronto marked the beginning of their physical and emotional separation. Meghan was ecstatic about the opportunity. For her, this was validation, proof that her years of struggling in small, forgettable roles had finally paid off. She threw herself into preparation with her usual precision. Wardrobe choices, dialogue rehearsals, media positioning. Trevor, though proud, couldn't ignore a quiet worry gnawing at him. He knew what long distance could do, especially in Hollywood, where temptation and ambition constantly competed with loyalty. But Meghan assured him she could handle it. She called the move an investment in their future. In reality, it was the start of the end. At first, the arrangement seemed manageable. They promised to visit each other every few weeks. Trevor sent care packages, small gifts, and handwritten notes to remind her of home. Meghan responded with polite gratitude. But as the months passed, Her replies grew shorter, less affectionate, and often delayed. The warmth in her messages was replaced by efficiency. She spoke more about her co-stars, her schedule, her press obligations, and less about him. Whenever Trevor hinted at missing her, she would respond with phrases like, "This is just a phase," or, "You know I'm doing this for us." But the us in those words began to feel increasingly theoretical. The emotional distance between them became more obvious during her visits back to Los Angeles. The reunions, once filled with excitement, started feeling staged. Trevor would meet her at the airport, expecting an embrace, but she would greet him with a quick, distracted smile, already speaking about upcoming projects or brand collaborations. Their conversations no longer revolved around shared experiences but revolved around her world. Her show, her friends, her rising visibility. She had grown used to being the center of attention in Toronto, and she carried that energy with her wherever she went. Trevor, ever supportive, tried to adjust. He wanted to believe that fame hadn't changed her, that they were simply adjusting to new dynamics. He began visiting her in Toronto, hoping proximity would reignite their closeness. But every visit left him more disoriented. The Meghan he encountered there wasn't the woman he knew. She was polished, disciplined, focused, but emotionally absent. He once described those visits as spending time with a hologram of my wife, perfect in form, but missing the human part. She would plan outings, dinners with castmates, photo opportunities, but never quiet moments alone. When Trevor suggested they skip a dinner to have a night together, she dismissed it, saying, "Networking is part of my job." One night, after a particularly awkward dinner with her cast, Trevor tried to have an honest talk. He asked her if she felt their relationship was slipping away. Meghan didn't argue or get defensive. She simply stared at him, silent, then said something that left him speechless. "I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be. Maybe we've outgrown each other." It was a line so calm and final that Trevor could only nod in disbelief. It wasn't shouted in anger. It was delivered with the composure of someone stating a business fact. That sentence, "We've outgrown each other," echoed in his mind for weeks. He tried to tell himself it was just stress speaking. He sent her letters trying to rekindle warmth, writing about their memories, their future plans, even inside jokes. But the replies never came. When he called, she was busy. When he visited, she was polite but distant. It was as if Meghan had put up an invisible curtain between them, one that he couldn't pull back no matter how hard he tried. The breaking point came unexpectedly. Trevor had mailed Meghan a set of personal mementos, small tokens from their early years together, photos, a letter he'd written before their wedding, and a DVD of one of his film projects she had once said inspired her. She received the package but never acknowledged it. Weeks later, he saw a photo online from a Toronto charity event. Meghan looked radiant, surrounded by people, smiling for the cameras. In that image, Trevor realized she had already moved on emotionally. "It was like she had erased me from her life before I even knew I was being written out," he later said. Their final months as husband and wife were defined by silence. There were no explosive arguments, no ultimatums, no confessions of betrayal. Just distance, polite, calculated, suffocating distance. Meghan had learned how to disconnect without confrontation. Trevor's calls went unanswered more often than not. When she did respond, her tone was mechanical. "Everything's fine," she would say. "You're overthinking." Those words, that dismissive phrase, became a pattern. He was always overthinking, while she was busy evolving. Friends on both sides began to sense what was coming. Meghan's colleagues in Toronto described her as independent, almost detached from her past. She rarely mentioned Trevor. Meanwhile, Trevor's friends noticed he had stopped talking about her altogether. One of them asked him bluntly if the marriage was over. Trevor hesitated, then said, "I think it's over for her. I'm just waiting for her to admit it." That admission came in the cruelest, most impersonal way imaginable. Meghan didn't call. She didn't write. Instead, one morning, Trevor received a small package via FedEx. Inside was her wedding ring, neatly placed in a velvet pouch. No note, no explanation, just the ring, a symbol of closure without words. Trevor said that moment shattered him. "It wasn't anger I felt," he recalled. "It was emptiness, like the story just ended without a final scene." That act, cold, detached, and deliberate, was Meghan's way of ending the chapter. There were no public statements, no shared interviews, no visible grief. She moved on seamlessly, as if the marriage had been a professional arrangement that had simply run its course. For Trevor, it was the emotional equivalent of being cut from a film during editing, erased without acknowledgement. In the months that followed, Trevor tried to understand what had happened. He replayed every memory, searching for signs he had missed. He realized that their relationship had been crumbling long before the physical separation. Meghan's focus had always been forward, never inward, never on the present. She was building toward something larger, something grander, something that required shedding anything that didn't fit the image. "I wasn't her partner anymore," Trevor said. "I was a chapter she needed to close before the next act." That next act, of course, would later introduce the world to Prince Harry, and the cycle of charm, strategy, and emotional choreography would play out again, this time on a global stage. But before that, Trevor was left with only memories and questions. He confided to a friend that the most painful part wasn't the way it ended, but the way it had been lived. "I don't think she ever stopped acting," he said. "Even with me. Maybe especially with me." The years that followed the divorce were marked by silence from both sides. Trevor refused to speak publicly, choosing dignity over exposure. Meghan, however, embraced her rebirth with calculated elegance. She rebranded herself as a humanitarian, a feminist, a modern woman of influence. To the public, she was thriving, liberated, confident, unstoppable. But to those who knew her past, the transformation looked like a familiar pattern. Another role, another reinvention, another performance built on the ashes of what came before. And while Meghan's ascent continued, Trevor was left with the lingering feeling of being part of a story that had been carefully edited. "She knows how to make people believe," he said years later. "But once the story's done, she moves on like it never existed." The Canada split, as some of Trevor's friends would later call it, wasn't dramatic, it was surgical, clean, efficient. Meghan had cut ties with the precision of someone closing a business deal. And that, perhaps, was what hurt most. There was no emotion, no chaos, no regret. Just a woman walking away from a chapter that no longer served her purpose. For Trevor, it took years to accept that the love he thought he had shared was never mutual in the way he believed. Meghan didn't love recklessly or deeply. She loved strategically. Her affection, her words, her actions, they were all part of a framework built for progress. And once that progress demanded sacrifice, Trevor became collateral damage. When asked years later what he would say to Meghan if he could see her again, Trevor didn't speak with bitterness. He simply said, "I'd tell her I hope she found what she was looking for, because it wasn't me." That line, quiet and heavy, sums up the truth of their separation. The marriage didn't explode. It dissolved under the weight of ambition and control. Meghan had always been moving forward, scripting her next scene. Trevor was merely left standing on the set, watching the woman he loved disappear into her next role, without ever looking back. After the marriage ended, Trevor Engelson disappeared from the public eye almost entirely. No interviews, no statements, no accusations. For a man who had lived in the entertainment industry, where silence often means guilt or defeat, his refusal to speak was deliberate. It wasn't because he had nothing to say. It was because he didn't see the point in talking when the world was already busy creating its own version of his story. Meghan Markle had moved on swiftly, seamlessly, as if the years they'd shared were nothing more than a prologue to her next act. And while the tabloids speculated, dramatized, and rewrote the narrative to paint her as the determined actress who outgrew her producer husband, Trevor said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was dignity. But silence, over time, can turn into a kind of quiet prison. In those first few years after the divorce, Trevor carried the weight of unspoken truth. Not to protect Meghan, but to protect himself. He didn't want to be the bitter ex-husband of a woman who would soon become one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He didn't want to be the man the press used to measure her rise. So he withdrew, channeling his energy into his work. He buried himself in producing films, developing projects, and rebuilding his life. But no matter how far he distanced himself from the past, her shadow followed him. The transformation of Meghan Markle from Hollywood actress to royal fiancée happened so quickly that Trevor could barely process it. When news broke that she was dating Prince Harry, Trevor found out the same way everyone else did, from the media. Friends say he was blindsided, not by jealousy, but by the speed of it all. He hadn't heard from her in years, and now her name was on every television screen, every magazine cover. She wasn't just famous anymore. She was historic. The girl who once struggled for recognition was now walking into palaces and shaking hands with monarchs. Trevor didn't speak publicly, but those who knew him well said the silence was heavy. He wasn't angry that she had moved on. He was unsettled by how easily she had erased their history. It was like we never existed, he once confided to a close friend. Not a mention, not a memory, not even a trace. When Meghan began speaking in interviews about her journey and finding love, she never referenced her first marriage, not even obliquely. The years with Trevor had been scrubbed from her story, as though they were inconvenient details in an otherwise inspiring narrative. That erasure hurt more than the divorce itself. For Trevor, those years were real. The laughter, the shared struggles, the nights spent dreaming of their future. But to the world, they had vanished. It was as if Meghan had pressed delete on everything that came before her royal transformation. And Trevor, still choosing silence, was forced to watch as strangers redefine the person he had known so intimately. For years, he refused offers to speak. Major outlets reached out repeatedly, offering interviews, documentaries, even book deals. He turned them all down. Friends advised him to tell his side before someone else did. But Trevor didn't want to feed the machine that had already devoured his privacy. "There's no winning," he told a colleague. "If I speak, I look bitter. If I stay quiet, I look weak." So he chose the only path that felt honest, stillness. But silence, like still water, hides undercurrents. As time passed and Meghan's public persona began to fracture under media scrutiny, people started asking questions. The image of the perfect Duchess began to blur. Reports surfaced about conflicts, staff resignations, and family tensions. The pattern felt hauntingly familiar to Trevor. He recognized the same traits: the need for control, the emotional calculation, the ability to turn any narrative into one where she appeared blameless. For years, he had tried to ignore it, convincing himself that their story was over. But the world's fascination with her kept dragging him back into a past he had tried to bury. What changed everything was not anger but exhaustion. By the time Trevor turned 48, he had reached a kind of emotional clarity. He was remarried, happy, stable, but still haunted by the ghost of his former life. The silence that once protected him had started to suffocate him. Every time Meghan's name appeared in the news, it brought back memories he had tried to suppress. Not because he missed her, but because the narrative was still unfinished. People were still asking, what really happened between them? Why had it ended so suddenly? And why did he never speak? When Trevor finally decided to break his silence, it wasn't a grand announcement or a televised confession. It was quiet, almost accidental. He began speaking openly in small circles, among trusted friends and collaborators. But word spreads quickly, especially when it involves someone tied to royalty. What started as private reflection soon turned into something more. People began quoting him, paraphrasing him, asking for confirmation. And slowly, his words began to surface. He didn't insult her. He didn't expose private details for shock value. Instead, his comments carried a weary honesty that cut deeper than any scandal could. Everything was scripted, even her emotions, he said. Those 7 words became the headline the world had been waiting for. Simple, direct, and devastating. In that single statement, Trevor had not only described their marriage, he had explained Meghan Markle's entire public existence. When pressed to elaborate, Trevor explained that he had spent years wondering how someone could appear so sincere and yet be so detached. "She didn't lie," he said quietly. "She performed." That line spread like wildfire. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, almost mournful. He wasn't trying to destroy her reputation. He was trying to reclaim his truth. For nearly a decade, his name had been attached to hers only as a footnote. Now, for the first time, he was telling the part of the story that no one else could. What struck people most about Trevor's confession was his restraint. He didn't yell or accuse. He spoke as someone who had accepted the truth long ago but was only now ready to articulate it. "She was always acting," he said. "I don't think she ever stopped." He went on to describe how even their most intimate moments felt staged. How every apology, every argument, every reconciliation had a rhythm to it, as if rehearsed. "She could cry on command," he said. "She could turn emotion on and off like a switch, but it never felt real. It was like watching a great performance that you wished you believed." The more he spoke, the clearer the picture became. Meghan's pattern of emotional control, first in Hollywood, then within the royal family, wasn't new. It was consistent. For Trevor, that realization brought closure. "I used to think I was the problem," he admitted. "That maybe I wasn't exciting enough, ambitious enough, or supportive enough. But now I see it wasn't about me. It was about the story she wanted to tell. And I just didn't fit the ending." Those who knew Trevor say his decision to speak came from reflection, not revenge. He had no interest in reliving the past. But as Meghan continued to dominate headlines, shaping her narrative, he felt compelled to balance the scales. Not for fame, but for peace. "There's a difference between silence and suppression," he told a producer friend. "I stayed silent out of respect, but now I'm speaking out for clarity." His words resonated with a global audience because they didn't sound like gossip. They sounded like truth. There was no malice, only exhaustion. "You can't be married to someone who's always playing a role," he said. "Eventually, you start wondering who they are when the cameras stop rolling. And then you realize they don't know either." When asked why he waited so long to speak, Trevor's answer was as revealing as it was heartbreaking. "Because it took me that long to understand what really happened."